So, ladies and gentlemen, the last topic of these sections with the topic of Germans and European startup ecosystem. And we have the honored speakers, project manager startup Bitkom Germany. So, please welcome คุณ Patrick Hansen ด้วยค่ะขอเสียงปรบมือดังๆต้อนรับด้วยค่ะ
Yeah, hi everybody. I'm really happy to be here, and I will talk in English as well, since I don't understand any word of Thai. I shortened the title a little bit, which was already announced. I will talk today about startup ecosystems and how to boost them on a more general and theoretical level. And I will do this in the following way. I will just quickly present Bitkom, the organization I come from. Then I will talk about the European and especially the German startup ecosystem and the term ecosystem in general. And I will then, in a third point, look at how one can boost a startup ecosystem and what regulation should consider in order to do so. So just quickly, in order for you to understand where I come from, Bitkom is the digital association in Germany and represents more than 2,500 companies. And we are therefore the biggest digital association in Germany and also in Europe. And part of this association is dedicated to startups. We have more than 400 startups right now, basically all tech-based. So we don't include all like basic e-commerce startup. We focus really on innovative tech startups. We therefore represent more than 90% of the ICT market in Germany, and we employ more than 2 million people. I mean, our members employ, not our company. We offer a wide range of technological services, and of course, we politically advocate for the digital transformation in Germany. And me, as responsible for startups, especially, I politically advocate for startup-friendly regulation on a regional, on a national level in Germany, but also on the EU level, which is very important for the startups as well. Yeah, exactly. We're the Europe's biggest think tank concerning the digital economy and new technologies. And our offer is basically to connect all the different players, the big companies, the small and medium-sized companies, and the new startups. This is just a short overview of different companies. We're mostly German, so here you see the German tech giants Telekom and SAP, for example. But we also include the whole American, the big 5 tech companies, Apple, Amazon, all of them, and also some Asian companies, for example, Huawei and others. Yeah, so now let's have a closer look. I mean, this is get started, the startup part of Bitkom, which was launched 5 years ago. And the goal is really to connect tech startups with the big companies in our association and to foster also the dialogue between politics and startups. So let's now have a closer look to startup ecosystems. I'm sorry, I will not focus that much on Asian and Thai ecosystem because I'm not an expert in this field. But later in the conclusions, we can conclude. I mean, those will be general ones. You can also draw to the tech startup ecosystem in Thailand and other Asian ecosystems. So, European startup ecosystems. You can see here that the number and the capital invested in European startups is increasing in the last several years. Now, when you look at the capital invested, you can see that the number of deals is decreasing a little bit, but the capital invested, the amount is still increasing. That means that we are now arriving at a point where not the mass of startups is important, but really the quality. The quality is now becoming more important than quantity. And when we look closer, for example, to nations in Europe, but also cities, we see here that in most rankings, you always see the UK on top, followed by Germany and France. You see this here for the countries, but as well for the active members in European cities. Now let's have a look at the capital invested, which is also always a good criteria for the startup ecosystem. Here also UK is ahead of all the others. But if we take, for example, if we include other countries of the world, we see here that Europe still lacks some proportions. For example, in comparison to Israel or the US, where a larger amount of money of the GDP is dedicated to startup investments and startup support. Here, for example, Germany is only like 10th or so. And this is something, for example, we try to foster through our association. We politically advocate for example, a more investment-friendly tax regulation in Germany, but also other mechanisms that try to support startup investments. So another quick look to the European hubs. Per capita invested, again, London, Berlin, Paris, almost every time the same framework. And if we have a closer look to EU regulation, this is an important point. You see here that regulation is really nation-based and depends on cultural and national factors as well. You see here, for example, that in my home country, Germany, the issue of data protection and privacy, the second point here, is way more important on a regulatory side than, for example, in the UK, and so on and so forth. In other countries, for example, here in France, for example, the employment factors is a really important one when it comes to startup regulation. And that's the first conclusion we should draw is that when you want to regulate the startup ecosystem, you should always take into account the national cultural factors. We'll see later how this is possible. Those are subsectors, technological subsectors. And you see here that even those are highly related to cultural and national factors. You see here that, for example, AI is quite a big thing in the UK, whereas in Central Europe, in Germany, for example, due to the big car production, autonomous vehicles is much more important, whereas in the north or in the Baltic region, for example, crypto and blockchain is a more important thing. And this could be a second point, that startup regulation should always try to concentrate on the excellent spots, on the strong points nationally and culturally, and try to create what we call a hub of excellence, and not trying to be competitive or all across. I mean, especially for emerging startup ecosystems, as for example here in Thailand, although it looks quite impressive already, one should focus on specific sectors. Here another quick comparison. You see here the investment in Israel, in the US, on a worldwide level is still far ahead of all the others. And this is something we really have to tackle if one wants to become competitive with those startup ecosystems. And this capital is mostly private capital. I mean, the nature of the capital is really important here. In the US, you have a lot of institutional funds, of pension funds, insurance funds, which are able to invest in startups. This is not yet true for Europe or Germany. And this is something one really has to tackle. It's impossible for a public sector to invest the same amount of money private firms can invest. And therefore, the government should really focus on enabling private investments. This is something, for example, our association achieved to do. Now Germany, the new coalition, a few months ago, wrote down in its coalition negotiations that it will introduce a tech fund, a growth tech fund, to enable institutional investors, pension funds to invest in startups. Since we here, a quick look to Asia, the capital invested in deals in Europe from involving Asian investors is increasing a lot as well. And of course, if there are any investors here or any interest people, we can talk later about more in detail about the startup ecosystem in Europe. So this is just one slide in order to show you where more or less the regional startup ecosystem is ranked on a worldwide level. You see here that the VC funding in startups by region is something that really is getting competitive from the Asian side. In the recent years, the Asian market is exploding as far as VC investments are concerned. But on the other graph, on the second one, you see that as far as exit values are concerned, Asia is still far behind USA and Europe, which is also normal since the Asian startup ecosystem is not as mature as the European and the Americans are for now. So just a quick look to the German startup ecosystem. I talked a little bit about the European one. And now the question is, why is Germany this important inside the European startup ecosystem? And there are two explanations. One is just a joking one. Startups is very much about focus, and in other European countries, it's impossible to focus. Here, for example, in Spain, it is way too sunny. In Italy, it is way too yummy. And France is way too pretty to focus on startups. And on a more factual level, Germany is really becoming the startup spot inside Europe. Because of different factors, for example, the number of professional developers in Europe, the startup ecosystems worldwide become more and more tech-based. So we're a bit going away from the e-commerce model, which was quite big in recent years, going to a more tech-based, technological startup creation ecosystem. And here, for example, if you ask the European founders which is the best place to capture opportunities in different technological subsectors, you can see here that Germany is ranked almost on top of every subsector, apart AI in the UK, crypto in the UK, and drones in France. Yeah, just a quick look to the startup ecosystem. Germany company creations, and this is true for almost all European countries, are falling in the recent years. But this is not due to a startup downfall, because if you look at company creations on a statistical level, this includes also bakeries, I mean non-digital companies. And if you look at more valid criteria, for example, the value and the number of financing rounds, you see here that the German ecosystem is quite increasing as well. If you look at the sector, I mean, I'm working in Berlin, and this is just to show you how important startups hubs can become inside a nation. In Berlin, almost 75% of the funding in Germany is concentrated in Berlin. And this is something that one should concentrate on when one tries to build a startup ecosystem and to boost one. It should always start on a more local level, on a city level, and then the effect can spill over to the more regional sites. Yeah, the amount of funding shows that e-commerce is still ahead, but the verticals, fintech, health, and so on are increasing. And this is also a sign for a maturing startup ecosystem is when the top volumes, the funding volumes, become very important, as here, for example, in the recent year in Germany, where only 5 companies could attract globally 1.3 billion euro. I think in Thailand, probably 1 billion should be the global startup investment, the VC investment in startups. Here it's only five companies. Investors also become more and more international, and we see here just a point, for example, which is important here, that funding is still concentrated to Europe and the USA. Therefore, what we try to do is also more and more to attract Asian investors and to look at the Asian markets. And this is something also really important we try to tackle, is the connection and the cooperation between startups and established companies. This graph is basically true for almost all economies across Europe and also the USA. So, since we are in the RegTech stage, let's now look at startup regulation on a more theoretical, general level. Is regulation more a handcuff or an enabler? And I mean, at first, it should be stated that it's really hard to make statements about startup regulation policies and startup regulation in general, since the criteria and the statistical empirics we have are really different across studies and everything else. Here, just a quick example. In the starting a business ranking of the World Bank, Germany ranks 113th, far behind Thailand, for example. But it's only because, I mean, with all the respect to this Thai startup ecosystem, it's mostly because only the administrative hurdles are taken into account. And in other, like more comprehensive studies, as for example the Global Entrepreneurship Index, where criteria regarding people, resources, institutions, the business environment, the culture are taken into account, it looks really different. This stems from the fact that in statistics, for example, the word startup or the term is not really comparable and valid yet, because every country has a different definition and therefore takes into account different types of companies under the name startup. This has led to, I mean, policy consultants and others to always suggest frameworks and startup regulations that worked in other countries, as for example the US and Israel, really successful ones, but they're not always adapted to the local particularities. That's just the first point in general. And on the other hand, this is contrary to the fact that the global startup ecosystem race is becoming more and more important, since we're now working in a global environment, and cities and nations compete for the best startups, talents, innovations, and the market-leading positions in the new technologies, which will create in some years the jobs and the growth returns of tomorrow. So, what are core features of a successful startup ecosystem? If you look at core features, one should say a successful startup ecosystem is always based on an already existing business cluster of related traditional industries. And it is always close to research centers, institutions of higher education, universities, which create a high amount of intellectual properties of patents and etc. And the third point is that the innovative subsectors, as for example now AI and blockchain, create successful cooperations and startup creations. This is something I already mentioned. Ecosystems should focus on one, especially emerging ones, on one subsector first, and always relate to a traditional strength here in the ecosystem. Key dimensions when we look at a successful startup ecosystem is first the size of the ecosystem, because the size will increase the production of scale-ups, and the scale-up production is the first point, is the point which will provide the job creation and the gross revenue. And then there are two very important points. It's first the local connectedness and the knowledge network inside an ecosystem, which is more important at a prior stage. and then the global connectedness of entrepreneurs, investors, etc., in an ecosystem, which will become more and more important in a later stage. And I mean, I don't mean LinkedIn connections or relations like that, but really intense personal relations, face-to-face of people, organizations, and so on. Opala. Here, I just want to focus once again on the global connectedness, because this is a very important point in the building of a successful startup ecosystem. For example, did you ever wonder why, for example, the startup ecosystem in Stockholm can produce scale-ups as, for example, Spotify, Skype, and so on, at such a rate, whereas other ecosystems, which are in terms of size 3 times bigger than Stockholm, as for example Chicago, do not produce any or far less scale-ups. This is really highly linked to the global connectedness of our startup ecosystem. And this means, I mean, the best opportunity for a startup ecosystem is to enter in what we call the virtuous startup ecosystem cycle. It's when an exit of a billion-dollar company triggers global attention, global resource attraction, and this is further fueling growth and global connectedness. Here, just a quick look to the graphs. We see here that, for example, Tel Aviv, due to the really small interior market, for example, is an ecosystem which is global from the first point. And others, as for example, the startup ecosystem in Beijing, is one that is quite big in size. As you can see, the bubble size is representing the inbound entrepreneur connections, but really lacks the global connectedness, which hampers the production of scale-ups and the entering in the virtual startup ecosystem. Here on the second graph, you see that revenue growth is highly related to the global connectedness as well. A quick look to another model of startup ecosystems, which is the startup ecosystem lifecycle model. Startup regulations should always be adapted to the different life cycles of the ecosystem. And here we basically say there are 4, one could say there are 3, it doesn't matter. The main point is regulation should always be adopted to the different stage. In the first stage, activation, that is, for example, an ecosystem with less than 1,000 startups and limited local experience and resources. The first focus should really be to grow and build a larger connected community on a local base, in a local framework, and activate local entrepreneurs, talent, via, for example, tech classes, English proficiency classes. We will look at concrete measures on the next slide. On the first stage, the globalization stage, with more or less 2,000 startups, it becomes more and more important to foster relations with the global startup ecosystem community, which will be then even more important in the third stage, when the startup ecosystem is already connected on a worldwide basis. It has already created unicorns and so on, and the only lacking is the funding. As for example in Germany, this is the, for example, would be the stage of Germany, a highly connected startup ecosystem, but with problems still in the funding compared to, for example, UK, Israel, or the Silicon Valley. And in the last stage, this is where regulations should focus on getting the benefits of the startup culture and the startup ecosystem. That means that the whole culture, the whole innovation sector should try to be pushed further to other regions, to other sectors, and to become part of the culture and the education as well. So this is these are some example measures one can take as a startup regulator or policymaker. in the first step, one should really focus on the local community. Foster the entrepreneurial spirit, English courses, education, culture, the local seed funding for a first step is really important here. And later on the globalization phase, one can already turn its focus on Series A funding, for example, start global growth programs, as for example in Germany, the German Tech Accelerator, which has already a booth just around here. And later on, for example, at least at the third expansion phase, global policy becomes more and more important. Here, in this step, one should really try to, for example, remove immigration barriers to let entrepreneurs, talents, and capital in, to enable work visas, to enable traveling around startup teams and investors, and so on and so forth. And on a last point, then the cultural integration of this startup spirit and culture becomes important. Yes, this is an example of really concrete solutions one can adopt. I mean, I can't go into detail of every measure right now, but I will try to just sum up some key takeaways. I mean, no, just a quick slide before that. Here you can see subsector life cycles. So when one tries to foster on a hub of excellence when creating a startup ecosystem, one should take into account this graph here that shows that sectors as, for example, edtech, digital media, or gaming is a sector which is still creating some exit growth, but it's already lacking the early stage growth to really create a vibrant and emerging startup ecosystem. So either the yellow, the verticals, health, fintech, and so on, agtech, or a sector which is producing early stage startups at the highest rates are those technological subsectors, as for example blockchain, AI, and manufacturing, also creating the biggest exits. So I won't go further into detail. I will just try to summarize the key takeaways to boost or to create a startup ecosystem in the first place. The first point is, I mean, I mentioned all of them already, is pool the core features of a successful startup ecosystem on the ground. That means the business cluster, the research centers, and the innovative new corporations in tech subsectors. The second point is to focus on the key dimensions of the startup ecosystem: the size, the local and global connectedness, and the scale-up production. The third point is to adapt the startup regulation policies always to the ecosystem life cycle. For example, the global expansion programs at a too early stage could hamper the startup ecosystem to grow and could lead to, for example, startup founders or new companies to leave the country instead of creating a local connectedness at first. Fourth point, concentrate on hubs of excellence, of booming technology subsectors. And last but not least, integrate the startup ecosystem locally, on a national level, on a cultural level, because it won't be successful to just adopt the Silicon Valley, for example, startup regulation policies, or the Tel Aviv and Israel startup regulation policies, if you don't concentrate on your strength on the ground and your industry and business focus on the ground. That's basically it. Thank you very much for your attention, and I will be here around. I'm happy to answer any questions if you have so. Thank you very much.
เอาละค่ะขอเสียงปรบมือดังๆให้กับคุณ Patrick Hansen ด้วยค่ะ Thank you very much for your amazing presentations.